On BBC Two tonight, success, but at what cost? Fortunes won and lost in financial drama industry at 9:15. Live to Joe Coburn now and today's big political issues.
It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Conservative peer and Chief Executive of the free market think tank, the Legatum Institute, Philippa Stroud. Guardian columnist, Owen Jones. The editor of The Spectator, Fraser Nelson, and the SNP's deputy leader in Westminster, Kirsten Oswald.
I am pleased, therefore, now to declare the Scottish Parliament open.
Boris Johnson says he thinks Scottish devolution has been a disaster. The SNP's not amused.
These comments just underline the contempt that Boris Johnson and the Tories at Westminster have for the people of Scotland making their choices.
Fears for stricter tiers once the lockdown in England ends.
In the new tiers, we'd like greater consistency, and we'll have to look at the evidence to see which of those measures was actually the most impactful.
There really are now solutions in our hands, and we need to deliver them to the people who can use them.
More vaccine hope, but should Big Pharma be profiting from COVID? Let's start the programme with those reported comments by Boris Johnson telling a virtual meeting of Conservative MPs that devolution has been a disaster in Scotland. He also reportedly described it as Tony Blair's biggest mistake. My question to the panel is he right, Boris Johnson, Philippa?
Thank you so much. I think I wasn't on the call, so didn't hear his comments, but I'm sure that he wasn't meaning that devolution was a mistake.
Well, that's what he said. It'd been a disaster in Scotland.
But I think what he was probably meaning was that the separateness and the battle over the future of Scotland and the fact that this is becoming a long-term kind of running sore is a real problem. And I think what we were longing for in devolution was for the creation of a strong Scotland that had power over its own decision-making.
Kirsten, what do you think? Is he right?
No, he's completely wrong, and the mask's really slipped here, hasn't it? Although that's not surprising for anyone in Scotland who's been watching, and Scotland has been watching Boris Johnson over the last couple of years. I think you only need to look at the chaos over Brexit, the entire failure of Boris Johnson and his UK government to take it into account either the interests and the discussions that the Scottish Government have wanted to have with him on that, or indeed the fact that Scotland didn't vote for Brexit, just like we didn't vote for Boris Johnson and his government. I think actually that it's entirely unsurprising that he said it out loud too, and it's also just par for the course that Philippa has said there that he didn't really mean that, he meant something else. This is something that we hear all the time about Boris Johnson. Oh, he didn't mean to say that, he meant to say something different, as various ministers are sent out to apologise for him. But he did mean that. That is what he thinks about devolution. It's not just in Scotland, it's also an issue in Northern Ireland and in Wales, where their governments have had the same difficulties with this Tory government in Westminster, which is content to ride roughshod over the views and over the interests of the devolved governments when they're trying to do their best by the people that live in these countries.
Fraser, was Boris Johnson right?
I certainly think that he's right to point out the bitter disappointment those of us who backed devolution had. And I thought it would narrow the inequalities between Scotland and England. And it has been, I'm afraid to say, a disaster in terms of what's happened to the poorest people in Scotland, what's happened to for example, there are now parts of Glasgow where the life expectancy is worse than Mongolia, is worse than Rwanda. That is an absolute outrage. I naively thought when devolution came around that people would be talking about this all the time, that all the combined wits of the Scottish Parliament would be thinking, how is Glasgow, which was the part of Glasgow that my dad's from, how has it fallen so much far behind the rest of Europe, let alone the rest of the UK? But people just don't talk about that anymore.
That's not correct, Fraser. That's just simply not
which
true.
What
people in Scotland are talking about are all of the positive things that the Scottish Parliament has been able to do for them. People in Scotland with their free prescriptions, people in Scotland with the ability to go to university without paying for tuition, the ability to have free school lunches without Marcus Rashford having to campaign for them. There are so many positives and so much great work going on with devolution, and that's what Boris Johnson has completely failed to see.
Fraser.
Let's take the point about university. If you are poor in Scotland, you are less likely to go to university than anywhere else in the UK. There were some figures a while ago showing you're twice as likely, if you're poor, to get into university than England than you are in Scotland. That is a disgrace. That is the exact opposite to what devolution was supposed to do. And I feel this, very strongly, because it's such a missed opportunity. Rather than focusing on the things which could really help, the gaps have got wider. The life expectancy gap is still there, ignored by pretty much everybody in the Scottish Parliament. How often do you hear the figure for life expectancy in North East Glasgow quoted? So when it comes to addressing these really big problems in Scotland, devolution has not succeeded in the way that I sincerely hoped it would when I supported 20 years ago.
Kirsten, I'll let you respond before I come to Owen.
That's appreciated. I think that Fraser, again, fails to take account of the fact that, for instance, in Scotland, an awful lot of young people go on to college and then to university from college. He's looking at things through a very peculiar and very unfortunate lens. I'm not sure that Fraser is really in touch with what's happening on the ground in Scotland, where people do sincerely value both devolution and the opportunities that presents for them and their families. These are precious things to people in Scotland. This is our democracy here, and our democracy can't stop just because Boris Johnson doesn't like the flavour of politician who are elected.
All right. I'm going to leave it just for the moment with the two of you. I'll come to Owen and we'll come back to this issue. Can I just return to the issue of devolution and what it was intended to do in the minds of Labour politicians at the time? You may remember George Robertson said devolution would end up killing nationalism stone dead. That hasn't happened, has it?
No, because both the Tories and Labour completely messed it up. I mean, look, when you get these comments, what it shows is contempt for the choices of the Scottish people who voted for devolution and overwhelmingly still support devolution. And it reminds me of that, to paraphrase the East German playwright Bertolt Brecht, if you've lost confidence in the people, dissolve them and elect a new one. The truth is, devolution could have been a huge success. But if you saw, firstly, the huge animosity which exists amongst large parts of Scotland towards the Conservatives because of the 80s onwards deindustrialisation, and then if we saw what happened to Labour in the so-called Red Wall seats last year, brittle foundations waiting to be swept away in an opportune moment, the foreshadow of that was Scotland. And what happened in 2014 is both Conservatives and Labour joined together in a campaign based on fear, which succeeded in keeping Scotland, but much narrower than it was originally supposed to be. And the other point was, do you remember the British government under David Cameron had the pledge to the Scottish people when that YouGov poll in the referendum terrified the establishment, is Scotland going to become independent? And then as soon as the referendum result came out, took to number 10, made inflammatory statements, tried to tap in to English nationalism. So I think both Scottish Labour lost its roots in Scotland and the Conservatives have deliberately stoked and antagonised the Scottish people. And I think if the British government didn't want independence for Scotland, which I think now is becoming an inevitability, I'm not sure what they would be doing differently.
All right, well, let's get some more reaction because the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Douglas Ross, has been giving an interview to the BBC and he was asked what he made of Boris Johnson's remarks.
I haven't spoken directly with them, but I've made representations and I'm speaking with them later on.
And what will you say?
I'm very clear. What I said in my response on social media last night and exactly what I'm saying to you, Glenn, right now. Devolution is not the issue. The issue is the SNP's obsession with independence, over-delivering for people in Scotland with the powers they have from the Scottish Parliament, with the Scottish Government being one of the most powerful devolved administrations anywhere in the world.
Did Boris Johnson misspeak, Philippa?
I think what Douglas Ross has just said there is really important. If the amount of energy that was put into campaigning for independence was put into the education, healthcare, trust in government, these are the sorts of things that would increase the prosperity of Scotland. And it's really important that when you have a battle going on like this over a very long period of time, it decreases the prosperity of a nation because it saps it of its energy, and Scotland should be putting all of its energy into raising the living standards of the Scottish people.
Can I ask, whose fault do you think it is, though, that the Scottish people have ended up supporting the Scottish National Party in huge numbers. I don't support the more independence, incidentally, and increasing independence. Is it not the combined failures of Labour and the Conservatives in Scotland, rather than the Scottish people who felt they had no choice but to support the Scottish National Party? It's not their fault, is it? It's the fault of Labour and the Tories.
It's certainly not the Scottish people's fault. But when you have a party that says, at the moment of a referendum, that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity...
Before Brexit happened, though, wasn't it?
And then keeps on at every moment coming back with stoking the fires of another referendum, a nation cannot settle and actually start building its prosperity.
Well, I'm on the same side as you on independence, incidentally, but were they not told in the referendum that the way to guarantee Scotland's membership of the EU was to vote to stay in the United Kingdom? That's been taken off the table, therefore circumstances change.
Well, I think it's really important that at this moment in time, as we leave the European Union and actually Scotland's market is challenged there, that actually the Union remains particularly strong at this moment of transition. That's going to be absolutely critical for Scotland's future prosperity.
I mean, Kirsten, Boris Johnson attacked devolution, but the SNP also attacked devolution, in fact, much more frequently in terms of the settlement, as your colleague John Nicholson did on the programme last week.
I don't think it's any secret to anyone that the SNP support independence for Scotland, and no wonder listening to some of these comments. Scotland didn't vote for Brexit, so to be told that what we really need to do is buckle in for this hard Brexit or no deal Brexit that nobody in Scotland, no local authority in area in Scotland voted for, it's really galling, to say the least, and to suggest that the SNP, having been voted for 14 years in various elections in Scotland, are to blame for a lack of trust in politics. It just doesn't stand up to scrutiny at all. Nobody is compelling the Scottish population to vote for the SNP. We're extremely grateful for the trust that people put in us. But it's absolutely clear, if you look at any of the metrics at the moment, that Nicola Sturgeon's levels of trust with the electorate are many, many, many times greater than those for Boris Johnson.
Well,
and the reason for that is that she is clear, she is focused, and she is speaking daily to the population in recognition of the fact that this is an extremely challenging time. But I must say it does show that we can do better, and we can do better by being an independent country.
She's right, though, isn't she, Fraser? And Boris Johnson is becoming something of an asset, if you like, for the SNP, which is what Douglas Ross is hinting at.
It's certainly true that Nicola Sturgeon's approval ratings are pretty high, which is extraordinary when you think about the relative performance of public services under the SNP. And I guess what Boris Johnson was referring to is a devolution, which was always intended as a plot to stop the SNP in its tracks, has failed disastrously from that perspective. You've now got a situation where several opinion polls now show a majority of the Scottish public in favour of separation, and it's likely that the SNP is going to win a majority in the Holyrood elections. It's also likely they will ask for a referendum. In that case, what does Boris Johnson do? Does he say, no, I'm not going to give it to you because I'm worried about what the answer will be in that referendum? If he does that, I suspect he probably would in those circumstances, then I fear that the support for independence would grow stronger. So yes, the Tories are in a very bad position right now. There's no denying that. In losing Ruth Davidson, they lost their best asset, and Douglas Ross is really struggling to replace her kind of charisma. It's funny that the Tories are still ahead of Labour in the opinion polls. The collapse of Labour in Scotland has really hurt the cause for unionism. So the union is in peril. There's no doubt about that. But nor is there any doubt about the disastrous failure of devolution to improve a lot for ordinary Scots, not the middle-class ones who predominantly go to university, the ones who would like to, but they can't because the support isn't there, the ones who end up in parts of cities where the deprivation is just off the scale when you compare it to what it should be for a country of Scotland's wealth and ability. Things are politically pretty tricky.
All right, let me just, Kirsten, just finally on this issue of giving permission, as Westminster see it, to Scotland to have another referendum. What will be the action taken? What should it be if it's refused and you do, again, top the elections next year?
If I can just go back briefly before I get to that.
Yes.
Fraser talked about devolution being put in place to try and somehow stymie the ambitions for independence. That's a shocking way to look at what is our democratic settlement. Devolution in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland is there as a means of a democratic government for these countries. And it should be treated with the respect that it deserves, because people elect members to these devolved governments in order that they can serve their communities. And if we look forward, Boris Johnson or any other Prime Minister is not in a position to refuse Scotland a referendum. It's not up to Boris Johnson, it's not up to Westminster or anyone else to decide what Scotland's future should be. The only people who have a say in that are the people in Scotland. So Fraser made the point, I think, quite sensibly, that it wouldn't go well for Boris Johnson to continue to refuse that. There have been 14 opinion polls in a row that have showed that people in Scotland support independence as a majority now. I think that it would do him no good whatsoever to try and stand in the way of the people.
We're going to leave it there for the moment and move on because the former Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who has been suspended from the party for comments he made in the wake of the EHRC, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, report into anti-Semitism into the Labour Party, for saying this, in fact, on the 29th of October. One anti-Semite is one too many, but the scale of the problem was also dramatically overstated for political reasons by our opponents inside and outside the party, as well as by much of the media. Now, he issued a clarification to the Labour Party soon after. This has now been published today, and this is part of it. To be clear, Jeremy Corbyn says concerns about anti-Semitism are neither exaggerated nor overstated. The point I wished to make was that the vast majority of Labour Party members were and remain committed anti-racists, deeply opposed to anti-Semitism. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Ian Watson. Ian, we know that Labour's ruling National Executive, the NEC, is deciding what should happen to Jeremy Corbyn in the midst of all this. But what's the significance of this clarification statement from Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, Joe, what Jeremy Corbyn's supporters will hope is that this clarification will see him readmitted to the Labour Party. In about half an hour's time, a panel of Labour's ruling National Executive will meet to discuss his case. They'll be looking at recommendations from party officials about how to go forward. And I think the reason that this statement, which was submitted to the Labour Party, came into the public domain today, it was no coincidence that that was on the day of Jeremy Corbyn's hearing. Now, what is interesting, I think, about the wording that you read out is that, in effect, Jeremy Corbyn is simply saying, yes, I was talking about the scale of anti-Semitism when I made the comments for which I was suspended. What he hasn't done, and what some people on the left were urging him to do, is to apologise for what he said in the wake of that EHRC report. Keir Starmer, of course, said he supported Jeremy Corbyn's suspension at the time. And given that he has now simply clarified rather than apologised for that comment, it does put the National Executive Committee members in a bit of a tricky situation. It's certainly my understanding he's likely to be readmitted to the party, but the question is what other action alongside that they may decide to take, because if they simply readmit him full stop, then they can expect the row over anti-Semitism to be reignited. For example, the British Board of Deputies of British Jews said today that Mr Corbyn's latest clarification was simply a pathetic non-apology. So there'll be a lot of pressure on Keir Starmer to respond to whatever is decided in the next few hours.
Ian, thank you very much for joining us today. Owen, how do you see it? Should he have just said sorry?
He said he regretted it. He expressed his regret, and I think that's an important clarification. I hope the suspension's lifted. And I think what needs to happen, because I think what's so tragic about this whole saga, is the focus should have been on the Labour Party and the left uniting around the implementation of the EHRC recommendations, uniting around accepting the hurt and distress that's been caused to Jewish people, not just in the Labour Party, but across the country by the existence of anti-Semitism, and then being able to move on and talk about other issues. Look, one point I'd make, I think all the way through this has been this problem often of a lack of emotional intelligence. And the point that I always made during this saga, okay, just give an example. I always, in pieces and speeches I made at the time, if I went round punching people, all of a sudden, I went round the street just punching people in the face. And then people on the right went, well, this just shows how violent the left is. Look at this prominent lefty commentator going around punching people. That doesn't mean I haven't, just because they're saying the left as a whole is violent and extrapolating or whatever in a way which I might find problematic, I've still caused hurt and distress to people, which is real and has to be acknowledged and has to be condemned and acted upon. And I think that's the problem. The hurt and distress that many Jews, a huge number of Jews, including people who are on the left, felt is real and has to be acknowledged. And the other point I'd make is, and this is why I think this is really important for the left, if it ends up, and I'm sometimes called head prefect when I make these points on television, but I think it needs to be said, if it ends up when people like me on the left end up coming on television, becoming the guys who are defensive and talking about anti-Semitism, there is no future for the left in this country. What we need to be talking about when we come on TVs like programmes like this is public ownership, taxing the rich, scrapping tuition.
So I come back to this point. If he just apologised, it might help move on.
Well, he said he'd regret it. I think regret. I mean, if we look up, I looked up regret, and regret is a synonym for saying sorry. I think if you say you regret, and I think the suspension does need to be lifted, and this is a time for the Labour Party to unite and accept the distress and move on.
Philippa, how does it seem to you?
So I think there's a big difference between saying I regret and saying I apologise. And he deliberately chose to say I regret and not apologise. I think Keir Starmer's been very clear. He wants an apology. The fact that he's chosen to say I regret, it's like saying I'm sorry for the mess I found myself in. I regret that these circumstances have happened. But there's no sense of I'm taking personal responsibility for them. I now understand the pain that I have caused to the Jewish community, and therefore I'm choosing to change my actions. And I think that is what Keir Starmer and the Labour Party need to be looking for.
Right. Well, Fraser, I mean, was it the right action to suspend Jeremy Corbyn then in the first place, or has it just made this matter worse for the party continuing to talk about it?
Oh, without doubt, it was the right decision. I mean, the Keir Starmer is going to have a long time to persuade voters that the Labour Party is back to the old Labour Party, as opposed to the version it became under Corbyn and the Corbynites. To actually expel a former leader is a very powerful mechanism. I know a lot of Tories, when that happened, were thinking, oh my, he actually looks serious about reforming the Labour Party, so they're quite worried. To let him in so quickly again after a relatively mealy-mouthed apology, and one, by the way, importantly, that's been rejected by the Jewish Board of Deputies, I don't think that would help with Keir Starmer's attempts to detoxify the Labour Party. He's got a lot of work to do, but I don't think you can doubt that he's quite sincere about that work. Now, had Jeremy Corbyn come out and said that he was genuinely sorry, not that he regrets the way this or that worked out, but he was sorry that he overlooked it, he could have done a lot more to confront anti-Semitism, but it was more ingrained in his party than he thought. An apology like that would come across more sincere. This just looks like a procedural mechanism to get him back in Keir Starmer's good books. And given the task Keir Starmer has in front of him to repair the reputational damage done to his party by the Corbyn years, I'd be surprised if Jeremy Corbyn gets back in anytime soon.
Right. I mean, I will come back to you, Owen, in just a second. Kirsten, should he be readmitted to the party?
That's absolutely a matter for the Labour Party. But I'm reflecting on the comments that I've just heard, and the thing that really strikes me is that I'm hearing an awful lot about politics and not very much about anti-Semitism, and I think that we need to turn this all on its head. I don't think that this should be an issue that we should be discussing in terms of politics or in a partisan way at all. Anti-Semitism is a really serious issue. I sit here in East Renfrewshire, which is where the majority of Scotland's Jewish population live, and I know the deep and profound hurt that has been caused. I think that the comments of the Board of Deputies are probably the comments that we should be focusing on here, and we should be really looking at all of this through the lens of what is anti-Semitism and what does this all mean for our Jewish communities.
Right, just before you respond, I mean, part of the EHRC report did say we found specific examples of harassment, discrimination and political interference. But equally of concern was a lack of leadership within the Labour Party on these issues, which is hard to reconcile with its stated commitment to a zero-tolerance approach to anti-Semitism. In other words, it wasn't just about the numbers and the scale. It was actually about politics as well. Kirsten has said it should be going broader than that. And isn't that still the issue for the Labour Party?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about racism, the focus should always be on the hurt and distress caused by those that racism is directed against. And I think what happened, and it is true, by the way, the Labour Party machine, when it was under the control of opponents of Jeremy Corbyn, had big questions to answer. Before 2018, the failure to act on complaints of anti-Semitism, that did improve after March 2018. But the point you're making, which is very critical, is it's not just about process, it's about showing emotional empathy, and that was lacking. But I must say this. One of the things that complicated the attempts to deal with a genuine problem that existed on the left were people with no credentials to talk about racism coming on national television to grandstand in the way Fraser Nelson has. And I'll just quickly explain. Fraser Nelson is the editor of The Spectator. One of his leading journalists, Rod Liddell, was booted out the Labour Party for racism. He's still published by The Spectator, good enough for The Spectator, booted out the Labour Party for racism.
All right.
No.
Well, no, because I'm going to get Fraser to respond.
He publishes articles which praise Greek neo-Nazis. He published one article entitled "In Defence of the Wehrmacht."
Sure.
Other articles which say there's not enough Islamophobia.
I will let Fraser talk about this, but people might think, is this a bit of you doing whataboutery? We're discussing Jeremy Corbyn today.
The point was, anti-Semitism is a genuine problem that Labour failed to address, and it was complicated by the fact that when people like myself said more action needed to be taken, people without the credentials to do so came on television and made people feel defensive and under attack and compromised those attempts to deal with it.
Let Fraser respond.
Well, there's been no articles defending Greek neo-Nazis.
Yes,
on the contrary,
hang on.
I'd be very. And the thing is, Owen, though I admire him very much as a writer, doesn't strike me as a Spectator reader. And I think he might have been misled by what he sees on Twitter.
No. Tacky, your columnist, wrote articles defending Greek neo-Nazis, the Golden Dawn. That's a fact, Fraser.
You'll come out with a phrase or a sentence here or there. You put it out on Twitter, and there's a kind of inverted pyramid of outrage. And people
everyone just Googled the fact that the Golden Dawn was praised by the Spectator's writers.
It's impossible to reconcile the sort of twittery things that Owen's saying with a magazine. And there's a difference between an opinion he doesn't like and racism and fascism. Now, one of the problems right now with the Twitter debate is that people are just so keen to take an opinion they disagree with and say, this guy's a racist, this guy's a fascist, without anything really, based on what? Two or three words?
I'm sorry, I can't let...
And that is a pretty strange way to conduct.
No.
Debate is good for social media, it's not so good for television. It's good for YouTube, so maybe Owen wants to give us a little spiel.
Fraser, anyone who Googles the fact that the Spectator published articles defending the Golden Dawn, which has been banned in Greece as a neo-Nazi organisation, Google it now, and you will find that's the case. And this is the problem. This is the problem. There is a problem of anti-Semitism on the left, which melds with conspiracy. And the problem is,
let Fraser respond to that article.
People like you with no moral authority.
Because you've made a bold claim. But
it's just a fact. It's a fact, and you can't deny it. And in defence of the Wehrmacht.
The article, the article he's referring to,
which was headlined "In Defence of the Wehrmacht,"
where we had a Greek writer saying he can understand, talking about the reasons why Greeks would support the far right. Now, I'm afraid to say that if you want to understand the evil of modern fascism, you need to also discuss the reasons why people are looking to it.
That's factually untrue.
The other article he's referring to was anyway. There's no point. Well, we can go down Owen's Twitter rabbit hole if he wants, but what he will not find is any actual article that fits the description he's laying out there.
That's not
This
true.
is a social media game, one that, he can knock himself out if he wants to play it, but it is impossible to reconcile with anything which is published in the magazine. And this sort of strange cancel culture where you try, rather than debate articles, you come up with shrill misrepresentations of what the other person's saying.
All right,
was Jeremy Corbyn the victim of cancel culture? This is an absurd misuse of the term cancel culture.
All right, listen, guys, I'm going to stop it there because I think we've had
a lovely contrast to shrill social media.
I think you've both had I think you've both had a fair crack of the whip without wanting to sound too much like a headmistress, because we're going to refer to something else that Jeremy Corbyn has tweeted, moving away from anti-Semitism, which is this: a vaccine should not become a privatised commodity used for corporate profiteering. Instead, it should be a global public good and shared with the world. Do you agree with that, Philippa?
So one of the things that concerns me about this statement is that it's divisive. If you think how we've got through this pandemic, it's actually by public and private sector working together. We've seen lots of businesses pivot in order to create PPE and hand sanitizer, and to send out a tweet like this at a moment of such optimism with the vaccine, I think is really sad. I also think that one of the things that we've been looking at is what produces prosperity in a nation. And actually, intellectual property rights is one of the things that's actually one of the key building blocks of creating an open economy, that people need to understand that their property rights will be respected. And there's absolutely no reason why these private companies can't license this vaccine to be used and made by lots and lots of other companies, but to start driving divisions, particularly when we're signatory to COVAX, we're going to be, as a nation, we're going to ensure that billions of these vaccines are going to be created and distributed to poorer nations around the world. I think it's a misunderstanding of the situation.
Right, Kirsten, I'm going to come to you in just a moment, but do you accept, Owen, that the development of successful vaccines by Pfizer, BioNTech and Moderna are examples of of private sector success and the free market economy.
Well, it's certainly a success of the ability of humanity in the face of the biggest crisis since World War II, if enough resources and commitment thrown at a problem, what it can achieve. But no, I mean, big pharma depends on public sector research and innovation. There's a brilliant book called The Entrepreneurial State by Professor Mariana Mazzucato. You've had him on this show.
We have.
A brilliant economist who makes that point, how they take often public sector innovation and repackage it. And the point, if you look at big pharma in the past, take, for example, the AIDS crisis, where they conspired to block generic versions, cheap generic versions being imported by cash-strapped African nations, about the fact a former Tory Lord, is it Lord O'Neill? I forget his name, that's terrible.
Well, don't say it if you can't remember
and a former Goldman Sachs banker who argued for a public option in pharmaceutical companies and possibly public ownership on the basis that they failed, for example, to deal with increasing resistance of antibiotics to bacteria because it's not profitable.
Right.
And I think
but in terms of the development of it, would it have happened without the profit motive?
So another way of doing it, because what you're talking about is patents, and that gives a pharmaceutical company monopoly over a product for 20 years, the ability to set whatever price they like. Another option, as well as a public option, is suggested by Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, which is you award prizes instead, and that could incentivise the treatment not just of big crises like this, but also other illnesses which affect poorer countries where there isn't profit to be made on the patent system.
Let me bring in Kirsten, because we've been watching, hopefully, patiently there in the background. Do you think Jeremy Corbyn and Owen have a point?
I think that there is an important point there, actually. I think that this is such a perilous and challenging time, and to aspire for there not to be the potential for companies to profiteer on the back of vaccine development and vaccine rollout, I think is perfectly reasonable. I think it couldn't be more critical that we make sure that all of the countries which need these vaccines are able to have them for the population. We need to make sure that that's done in a measured and a fair and equitable way. And I think that the comment which your earlier panellists said, where she said it was divisive to express these concerns, is something that I don't really understand. I can't imagine why we would want to do anything other than make sure that there is the ability to roll out vaccines as needed, whether here in Scotland, whether in the UK, or whether across the world. This is one of the most difficult and challenging times in most of our lifetimes, and we need to get this right.
Philippa?
Yeah, so when I was talking about divisive, I was saying it was pitting against the private sector against the public sector. The great wins in this pandemic have come actually when the private and the public sector have worked together. And it's a real shame that Jeremy Corbyn at this moment in time is trying to drive a wedge down the middle when we've got the opportunity through private sector innovation and through the UK government signing up to COVAX to ensure that disadvantaged nations or emerging nations around the world get access to this very important vaccine at exactly the same time as we do.
Right, Fraser, I mean, Oxfam have carried out a study this autumn showing that 13% of the world's population had secured more than half of the world's leading coronavirus vaccines. So this, in a way, is the consequence of what Jeremy Corbyn is worrying about. I mean, how would it work, in your mind, if it was sort of nationalised, in a sense, the pharmaceutical industry?
I don't think we'll be getting very many vaccines, that's for sure. If you look at the history of this, I mean, some of the pharmaceutical companies, what they do is they plough huge amounts of money into vaccines that probably the odds are that they're not going to work. I mean, Pfizer, for example, recently came out with a breast cancer treatment, which they put huge amounts of money into there, and it looks like it's not going to work. That the stock market price went crashing down. To take those kinds of risks, I think you do need to be done in the independent sector. I'm not sure government is a particularly better alternative. I mean, if you think that the pharmaceutical companies don't do it very well, just wait until government gets its hands on it. And of course, the government do receive support from government, but sorry, the pharmaceutical companies do receive support from government, but they pay huge amounts of taxes on their profits, and that's the way a normal society would work. Big Pharma, the much maligned Big Pharma, looks like it's about to give us 3, perhaps 4 COVID vaccines. Now, that's not bad, a gift from an industry to the rest. So this is exactly society working as it should be.
Right.
I think they should be allowed to recover their costs.
The problem is, if you have it's based on a profit incentive, obviously with coronavirus, there's a existential crisis facing society as we know it. And clearly, Big Pharma's thrown everything at it with the support of government research and development, public sector research and development. The problem is, firstly, as you've noted, a lot of developing countries, I mean, it's not hit Africa as badly as AIDS did, for example, but Latin America, those countries won't get access to the vaccine in time in the same way developed countries will. But the point about, as I've said, about the profit motive is it means big pharma throw research at things, for example, illnesses that affect older, affluent people in Western nations, but don't deal with other illnesses that affect poorer people in poorer countries because the profit isn't there to be made. That's why the system is broken.
Fraser?
If the system was broken, we would be having no vaccines right now. Instead, the independent pharmaceutical industry is coming out with lots. Now, I've got my criticisms about Big Pharma, but right now, I'm afraid to say it's difficult to really criticise them. Well, they're coming out for our only hope of getting out of this mess right now. And I'd be quite surprised if they make out like bandits as a result of this. Quite a lot of the pharma companies have said that they don't intend to profiteer this way. They're doing quite a lot now to make sure the drugs are available for the third world, to address the point that Oxfam makes. And I'm afraid to say you need a system where independent scientists can get together and research on the basis that 9 out of 10 things they try is going to fail, one of them is going to succeed, and when one that succeeds, it doesn't just need to cover its own costs, it needs to cover for costs for the 9 experiments that failed. That's the way the industry works.
All right, we're going to move on to something called the Prosperity Index, which is authored by you, Philippa, at the Legatum Institute. I'm just going to show everyone this graph. You can see that Denmark comes out as number 1, according to your index, and the United Kingdom is at 13. Now, this was done pre-COVID.
Yes.
So is it meaningless now, Philippa, without being too rude, because COVID's changed everything?
And one of the things that the index shows quite clearly is that actually prosperity is multivariate. So what it means is that it's developed with strong economies, strong societies and empowered people. And that actually, if you only focus in on one element, so for instance, as we've been doing in the UK on health, and you neglect everything else, so for instance, your personal freedoms or your trust in government, then actually your prosperity decreases in those other areas. And so actually it's got a lot to teach us at a moment of crisis, because it shows us what we want to be protecting. The good news for us is that global prosperity has never been higher.
Right.
So if there is a moment to have a global health crisis, it is against the backdrop of living conditions having improved around the world. Small comfort, but it is that increase in global prosperity.
Right. Kirsten, do you agree that actually perhaps the focus should be more on the economy then and the living standards, and there's been too much focus on health or healthcare?
No, I don't think that's right. And I was really interested in having a look at the report. I thought that there was a lot of fascinating stuff in there. Probably the most fascinating was that the UK came out 13th. Actually thought that it wouldn't have come out in quite such a high place based upon the factors that Philippa has talked about. So I know that some of the factors include rule of law, include trust and include good governance, and we don't have to look very far back over the last couple of months to see the UK government breaking the law, seeking deliberately to break international law. I think in terms of good governance, the cronyism rows which are floating about in a very troubling way at the moment should be something that significantly concern us all. And trust in the UK government, I would suggest, is at a very low ebb. So I wonder if the figures were run again right now today, what these figures would come out saying about the UK, because from where I'm sitting, it's not in a positive position. I think that damages us all. And I would be really interested to see how that would all factor in if we ran it now after the first year or so of COVID.
Wow. Philippa?
Yeah, so I think we're very good at being down on ourselves in the UK. The fact that we're 13th is actually a reflection of the fact that we have some of the highest living conditions in the world. We have one of the best education and health systems in the world, and we have one of the most dynamic economies. There is a message of warning in this year's index, and that is that our prosperity is beginning to stagnate. What is interesting is that is mainly driven not by our hard data, things like living conditions in the economy, but actually how we perceive ourselves, our confidence, the confidence of the British people in our levels of social tolerance, the confidence of our business sector in our property rights and, for instance, how goods can transition across the borders. So these are interesting things that actually we as a country could be in danger of talking ourselves down in prosperity terms.
What do you think lockdown...
I wonder what the
sorry, Kirsten. Go on, Kirsten.
means in terms of transition across borders. I think that, these are undoubtedly really important issues, but when we look at the Brexit cliff edge that's approaching us, I think that there's going to be significant and very justified concern from businesses and business people about what that means in terms of both prosperity and in terms, indeed, of good governance.
Right. Fraser, when we talk about prosperity in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, will the UK also be judged like other countries in terms of how effectively they've been able to actually tackle the pandemic? Because some of the more authoritarian regimes arguably have done rather well because they are authoritarian, and here in the UK they've struggled somewhat.
I'm not sure I quite buy that authoritarianism works. It's certainly true that in China and East Asia, there have been far lower COVID, certainly when the second wave comes along. It's been night and day difference. But you've got democracies like South Korea that have handled that quite well as well. And I think when it comes to, the funny thing about the Prosperity Index is there's not almost a nostalgic feel to it now. This is how things were before the pandemic. How countries emerge afterwards could be a very different story. The amount of debt which we'll be carrying, the amount of inequality that it will have deepened over these months of lockdown. It could take us years to come out of this, to get back to the situation we were in at the time that Vilgatim's report was conducted. So I think the countries will be judged, sure, partly in how they handle the pandemic, also about the collateral damage to health inequalities, to social inequalities as they handle the pandemic, and also how fast they recover. Now, that test has yet to be applied, but I think it's going to be some time before Britain or many of the other Western countries are going to get back to the level of prosperity that we saw last year.
I think it would be tragic if the conclusion is that this is a vindication for authoritarianism. It isn't, and it lets the government here off the hook. It was possible to handle this better without suspending our democratic norms and hard-fought-for rights and freedoms.
So how do you view lockdown?
Well, this is the point about prosperity, isn't it? Because one of the main reasons the government delayed lockdown was because they thought that it would be such a massive hit to the economy. But the public health versus the economy argument was always a false dichotomy, because if we'd have locked down earlier, we would have had a worse outbreak, a less bad outbreak, less people would have died, but it would have taken less long to bring infections under control. The problem we ended up with is the worst of both worlds, because we ended up with the worst death toll in Europe and the worst economic consequences. If we'd got a handle, for example, locking down earlier, not handing test and trace to scandal-ridden private contractors, then actually we would have brought the infections down and the economic consequences would not have been as adverse.
All right, well, talking of lockdown, let me just show you this headline in the Daily Telegraph. There's Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary. Lockdown looms over Christmas. Philippa, how have you viewed lockdown and the prospect of quite strict restrictions still being in place at Christmas?
So one of the things that concerns me is the way in which we've just yielded our personal freedoms. As a liberal democracy, we should be actually thinking, China, 90th for governance and 159th for personal freedom. Fine, that's the way they want to handle it. How do we want to handle it according to our values? And actually, we should be working much more with the personal responsibility of the British people and actually treating us much more like adults so that you don't have this kind of coercion, but you have much greater levels of cooperation. Actually, the British people, if you give them the facts and you allow them to respond, you will find actually that they do make the right decisions.
OK, Kirsten, very briefly, because we're running out of time. What about restrictions in Scotland? Stricter ones along the way for Glasgow?
Possibly. So we don't know yet. We'll have to wait until the First Minister makes her statement in the Chamber of the Scottish Parliament later on. And it's also possible, perhaps even likely, that some other areas of Scotland will see their levels moving down, so they will be less restricted. But ultimately, all of this has to come down to the progress of the disease. That's what it has to be for everyone. No politicians will want to make these decisions, but ultimately, that's what will have to happen.
Right. 10 seconds.
Oh, blimey, I didn't expect that. The point you've made, this is a collective problem. It needs a collective solution. And if you just accept individuals to make choices, infections will go up and people will die and our NHS will be overwhelmed.
And we'll be back at 11:15 tomorrow. Bye-bye.